What does it feel like to share vodka with your sworn enemy one night, then storm an enemy camp together the next morning? In 2001, deep in the mountains of Kosovo, a team of US Army Green Berets experienced exactly that when they conducted what's believed to be the only joint combat mission between American Special Forces and Russian Spetsnaz in history. What is mind-bending about this is that just years before, these same soldiers had trained to kill each other during the Cold War. But what really happened when former enemies became temporary allies in the chaos of the Balkans? You'll find out through the extraordinary story of the most unlikely military partnership ever recorded. After decades of Cold War hostility, American and Russian soldiers had been trained to see each other as the ultimate enemy. Green Berets like Mark Giaconia had joined the military in 1991 when killing Russians should be my primary goal in life, as he put it. Yet in March 2001, these former enemies found themselves sharing vodka, swapping war stories, and preparing to storm an enemy camp together in the mountains of Kosovo. NATO had just bombed Serbia in 1999, and Russian troops had seized Pristina airport in a tense standoff with British forces. But now both sides were peacekeepers in the same theatre, operating in the complex aftermath of the Kosovo War. When the Spetsnaz arrived, it was like meeting your mirror image on the other side. Professional soldiers with similar training, similar equipment, and the same warrior mentality. Just different flags. And oh boy, they were about to discover they made devastatingly effective partners against a common enemy. The situation in Kosovo was a diplomatic nightmare that somehow created the perfect conditions for this unprecedented cooperation. The Kumanovo Agreement that ended the Kosovo War established a 5-kilometer-wide ground safety zone between Kosovo and Serbia, designed to keep the peace and protect civilians who had suffered immensely during the conflict. But this demilitarized zone had become a safe haven for extremist groups like the UCPMB, the Liberation Army of Preševo, Medvedja and Bujanovac. These Albanian splinter militias rejected the peace agreement and continued fighting from the mountainous border region where Serbian forces couldn't reach them. They were armed with black market weapons that had flooded the Balkans after Yugoslavia's violent breakup. The peacekeeping force known as KFOR included troops from multiple nations, but coordinating between Russian and NATO forces was a constant challenge. Russia had around 3,150 troops operating independently in their own sectors, while the US had 5,500 troops. To say things were tense in 2001 would be a massive understatement. That's where the Green Berets came in. In March 2001, an operational detachment Alpha from the 10th Special Forces Group was assigned to work alongside Russian forces based out of the town of Gunjilane as part of a 6-month liaison mission. Mark Giaconia's team was replacing another ODA that had struggled with the Russians due to language barriers and lingering Cold War attitudes. Fortunately, Giaconia's team leader had learned Russian at the Defense Language Institute, which would prove crucial for what happened next. At their shared base in Gunjilan, the real bonding began during off-duty hours. Russian Spetsnaz and VDV paratroopers invited their American counterparts to traditional vodka drinking contests and sauna endurance challenges. Both sides were eager to prove who could drink more or last longer in a Russian sauna. The same competitive spirit that made them elite soldiers. The cultural exchanges were fascinating. Working alongside foreign militaries was standard for Green Berets, but for decades these assignments had been working against the Russians, not with them. Giaconia described it as strange to be working jointly with soldiers he'd been taught to kill just a decade earlier. The Russians were a mix of Spetsnaz and VDV paratroopers, though they gave only intentionally vague answers about which specific units they belonged to. Despite their fearsome reputation, Giaconia found them similar to the thousands of soldiers he'd met in other militaries, professional warriors with families, and the same dark humor that comes with military service. But the most telling conversation came when a Russian soldier asked point blank whether Americans really thought the Soviets would launch nuclear weapons during the Cold War. The American said he didn't think so, while the Russian admitted he genuinely believed American nuclear strikes were imminent throughout the 1980s, saying, "You nuked Japan, so why wouldn't you nuke Russia?" Both sides realized how distorted their understanding of each other had been. The breakthrough moment came when a Russian colonel invited the American captain on what seemed like a routine patrol. They drove north for hours until the American checked his GPS and realized they had crossed into Serbia itself, far beyond where US forces were supposed to operate. The American started whispering to his teammate about throwing grenades and running for it, convinced they'd been set up. Instead, the Russian colonel praised the Americans to Serbian military commanders, complimenting how well they were helping clamp down on Albanian rebels. Soon they were all sharing traditional rakia brandy and swapping stories about recent wars, politicians, and the insanity of the Cold War. Right there on a dirt road in Serbia, sworn enemies from recent history were bonding over their shared experiences. This impromptu diplomatic mission actually made life easier for the Green Berets. The Serbian commander shared locations of recent UCPMB activity and spread word that the Americans were on their side. The insurgents grew sloppy, terrified that Americans and Russians had joined forces with Serbians to root them out. But the partnership faced its ultimate test when violence shattered their growing brotherhood. An Albanian sniper from the UCPMB shot and killed a Russian soldier on patrol with an exceptionally skilled headshot from over 800 meters away. Many of the UCPMB fighters were veterans of the Kosovo Liberation Army, so such marksmanship seemed plausible. The Russian reaction was immediate and emotional. These weren't just allies now, they were brothers in arms who had lost one of their own. The Green Berets didn't hesitate to help, calling in American helicopters for medical evacuation, since the Russians had to route requests through their own command all the way to Moscow and back down through NATO headquarters. But it was too late. After bouncing through mountain terrain for an hour and a half, the joint convoy reached the scene to find the sniper had made a perfect kill shot. The Russians were furious and out for blood, determined to find the sniper who had killed their comrade. The Green Berets, despite having no official mandate to hunt insurgents, found themselves drawn into what would become a joint manhunt through Kosovo's wilderness. The next few days turned into an all-out manhunt through the entire Russian sector of the border zone. The joint task force got their lucky break when they spotted a suspicious, military-aged man walking alone down a dirt road far from any village, wearing a green military belt and looking completely out of place in such a remote location. The Russians apprehended him and brought him back to base for interrogation. What happened during that hour behind one of the buildings remains deliberately vague in official accounts, but the Russians emerged with precise intelligence. A UCPMB base camp hidden in the forest near Vagoglava, housing anywhere between 40 and 80 fighters. For Mark Giaconia, a Special Forces weapons sergeant, this would be his first real combat experience. It's hard to imagine that a Green Beret hadn't fired his weapon in combat for so long, but the world was a very different place before 9/11. Actual combat was pretty rare even for Special Forces teams, but he wasn't going in alone. He was part of an unprecedented Russian-American strike force that would test whether former enemies could really fight together effectively. The joint convoy that rolled out that morning was unlike anything seen before or since in military history. American Humvees and Russian BTR armored personnel carriers moved together through Kosovo's mountainous terrain, following muddy tracks toward an enemy camp so well camouflaged that NATO aircraft had never spotted it. It must have been an odd sight, American and Russian vehicles racing through the valleys of Kosovo together. Giaconia manned an MK-19 automatic grenade launcher from the turret of one of the American vehicles. The MK-19 fires 40mm high-explosive grenades at 375 rounds per minute, devastating firepower designed to obliterate everything in its path. The UCPMB fighters had hidden their camp well, using branches and foliage to mask their tents and pathways from aerial reconnaissance. Giaconia estimated the camp covered 4 to 5 acres, and as they approached, he realized this wasn't training anymore. Somewhere ahead, dozens of armed fighters were waiting in prepared positions. They reached a gate marked Stop UCPMB with a startled guard in a red beret holding an AK-47. The guard was completely surprised by the sight of American and Russian vehicles working together. 2 Green Berets quickly disarmed the stunned sentry and opened the gate, while Russian Spetsnaz troops leaped from their BTRS and advanced through the woods to the left of the road. Giaconia's driver slowly advanced past the gate, and he lost sight of the Russians in the dense trees and thickets. The whole place was starting to come alive with motion and shouting as fighters scrambled to respond to the unexpected attack. That's when the shooting started. Giaconia heard shouting in Albanian, followed immediately by the distinctive crack of incoming gunfire. Bullets snapped past his head, dropping twigs and leaves around his position. His adrenaline surged as he realized they were taking effective fire from multiple positions. For a weapons sergeant who had spent years training for this moment, there was no hesitation. Giaconia couldn't see much through the thick forest, but if he didn't act now, he might not have a chance to regret it later. He thumbed the trigger on the Mk-19 and sent a devastating volley of 40mm grenades into the forest in the general direction the shots had come from. The sound and concussion of high-explosive grenades detonating in the dense forest was overwhelming. Trees splintered, smoke filled the air, and the continuous explosions created a hellish barrage that shook the air. Each grenade creates a lethal fragmentation radius of 15 meters, and Giaconia was firing them as fast as the weapon could cycle. A sustained barrage of destruction that lasted less than a minute but felt like hours. Other team members added their small arms fire, while Giaconia reloaded the mounted weapon. The forest erupted in smoke and flying debris as his suppressive fire gave the Russian Spetsnaz room to maneuver through the trees. It was exactly the kind of coordinated fire and movement that both armies had practiced for decades, just never together. Then their captain called for ceasefire, and the forest went silent except for the ringing in everyone's ears. Giaconia grabbed an M240 machine gun and pressed out with his team to form a perimeter, but no return fire came through the smoke and pulverized trees. 20 minutes later, it was all over. Through the smoke and devastation, Russian Spetsnaz emerged escorting 9 Albanian prisoners, several of them wounded by Giaconia's grenade barrage. The Russians actually commended his effective suppressing fire, saying it allowed them to advance along the left flank and capture the fighters alive. Hidden under natural camouflage, they found a makeshift armory full of machine guns, mortars, landmines, explosives, and enough weapons to arm a small army. The UCPMB had been using this base to launch attacks throughout the region, and coalition forces had never known it existed. For Giaconia, it was a surreal introduction to combat. His first firefight wasn't against Russian enemies he'd trained to fight, but alongside Russian allies against a common threat. The professional respect was mutual. Both sides had seen each other perform under fire and came away impressed. The joint team raided several more UCPMB locations over the following weeks, but the insurgency collapsed within weeks as fighters laid down their arms. Whether it was the shock of seeing Americans and Russians cooperating, or simply effective dismantling of their infrastructure, the operations had broken the insurgent will to fight. Giaconia later questioned whether some details were accurate. A Russian soldier suggested the sniper incident might have been more complex, possibly covering up an accidental death. Regardless, American and Russian special forces had worked together successfully in combat, for the first and likely last time. Just months after this deployment, September 11th fundamentally altered American priorities. The war on terror consumed special forces' attention for 2 decades, while Russia pursued its own interests in Georgia and Ukraine. By 2008, Russian forces were fighting Georgian troops trained by Americans. By 2014, Russian special forces operated in Ukraine against NATO-equipped forces. The Kosovo mission marked perhaps the only time Russian and American special forces fought as true allies. For a few months in 2001, former enemies proved they could be extraordinary partners when fighting for the same cause. Whether such cooperation will ever be possible again remains one of the great questions of modern geopolitics.